One of the concepts that we want to make sure we cover in more detail is the idea of supply. Now supply is this concept of the market needs products and producers create those products, and that's who brings these things to the supply chain. Well, what really drives a producer, and the term that's easiest to talk about, there are a lot of things, of course, but one is profit. Now, profit identified here is pi. Profit, if you move down to this first stage here, I'm looking at, it's really just price times quantity. So whatever you sell times however many of them you sell, minus the cost, that equals this concept of profit. However, if we keep going a little bit, price and quantity are still multiplied by each other. But when we subtract cost, there's really two types. One of these types is a variable cost, and the other is a fixed cost. Now, you can control your fixed cost somewhat. You can control all of your variable costs somewhat. But once you make a decision to produce, these variable costs are the ones that really start to be a factor. So really, as producers make decisions to move forward, variable cost is really what controls a lot of their decisions. Fixed cost is sometimes referred to as a sunk cost. That's another way to look at that. All right, and again, both of those equal, minus both of those equals profit. So moving down a little bit more, and we're thinking about price. When we think about price risk, the idea of price, meaning that we don't know what our price will be, creates this concept of risk. So we're not really sure what the price is going to be. That creates risk. What about quantity of production? Well, that can depend a lot, and the quantity of production is really going to have a lot to do with classes like animal science or plant science and range. So these classes are identifying what maximum quantity can be produced the most efficiently. And then really when we start taking a look at, so then both of these have different risk factors that go along with them. Variable cost is the one we said again was the primary cost that producers manage, and that changes as you go through the production cycle. And so understanding that and trying to manage that as a producer is important. But that has a whole lot to do with supply, because the supply decision, as I said before, is managed through variable cost. And then fixed cost, again, another word we already talked about called sunk cost. That actually is going to be something that we need to try to manage, but once we have it, it's going to be set. So the idea of profit, again, identified as pi here, the idea of profit is that there are several variables that relate. And so as we start looking at supply in the marketplace and how does that work, we end up with the same concept before, except when we talk about price here, now we're talking about cost of production, or what you have in your product, and then you have, of course, quantity where you produce. Well, the way it works in production is that when we first start off, so I'm going to start off like here, and I'm going to say that your beginning decision is somewhere in here, and you're going to produce a certain amount of quantity, of course, very low, you're just getting started. You're going to have a cost that's going to be relatively high up front, and that's because fixed cost is going to be a cost that we end up having to deal with, as we mentioned. So in the very beginning, when you first start producing, fixed cost costs you a lot. Well, as you start producing, variable cost over time has a relationship. As we produce, our variable cost should help us become more efficient, because as we produce more, we are having more production for every dollar we spent in variable cost. So we end up with a lower cost per unit as we go. In other words, price. So as we move through time, though, we will see that our costs start to increase again. And so that's this concept that once we start producing so much, we become less and less efficient. And so really this whole area here sometimes is a term called economies of scale, meaning that as you start to get, through here. So as we start to get more and more production, we end up with economies of scale, which is going to help us identify that we are more efficient. However, that efficiency does not last. If the market still will want our product, we will still keep producing it, even if our costs seem to actually start going up again. Overall, the question is, what is the cost that we have in the product, and that's going to be relative to what our production is in quantity that we shoot for. All right, so this is how the cost curve works. It's factoring in variable cost and fixed cost. So I'm plugging both of these in at the same time. So we've got variable cost and fixed cost plugged into here, and then we call that total cost. And so you may recognize some of this from your introduction to economics. However, there's a very important line, and in economics we call it marginal cost. And so marginal cost is going to be the concept of the change, a little triangle there to talk about. It's the changing cost as we change our quantity of production. So this is a term called marginal cost. Marginal refers to the concept of change, and so that is what marginal cost is. All right, so if you have this production, again, let's review, starts off low production, but a high cost. But because we are efficient, we start becoming more and more efficient. And again, that's called economies of scale. As we move through, at some point, the market will still say it wants more. And so we put on new technology, and we increase our production efforts. We fertilize more. We use new hybrid varieties of seed. Those don't cost less. They cost more. The idea is we'll get more production out of it, but overall, we end up with costs going up. Now, marginal cost measures the change, and that's really what matters to producers. As I make a decision to change production, there's a cost associated with it, and what is that? That is the concept of marginal cost. And actually, when it comes to supply, so let's move down here and redraw this all over again. When it comes to a supply decision, oops, where I was going with that. This supply decision is really described best by a producer's, well, let's draw that again a little bit better. It really is based on a producer's marginal cost, because that is their supply curve. Because every time production changes to a new target level, we end up with a new cost. Every time we try to increase that idea with a new variety of seed, we're looking to probably invest more money. And so if you took all the producer's supply curves, so this is for producer one, and every producer has their own supply curve. So this concept of supply is really going to be per producer. Well, if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, if you've got a whole bunch of producers, the total supply in the marketplace. So supply in the market then is equal to the marginal cost curve, I should say, of each producer. So where does supply come from? Supply comes from the marginal cost of producers in the chain. The more producers that are out there, the more of these supply curves you have, the more supply in the market is going to change. And so we'll talk about that as we look at the market again. But this is the concept of supply. In fact, why don't I just move it down? So really what we're looking at here before, I drew for you when we were talking about demand, this concept of supply. Because this portion of the supply curve that we have here is really not anything to even consider, so we really ignore that. So the supply curve starts once they make their decision to start producing, and it goes from various amounts. And these are all the different ways that producers can try to produce. Now, what if there are more producers in the marketplace? More producers in the marketplace would have a supply that shifts to the right. So FS1 is an increase in supply because there are more marginal cost curves out there. So that's what causes it to shift this way, because our marginal cost numbers are up. In other words, we have more of them. What if producers leave the market? Then you've got this S-1, which would be a decrease in supply and that's an increase in supply. And so that's based on the number of producers. What about if technology changes? So as technology changes, it affects the cost of production. So it is quite possible. So this whole thing up here is called a change in supply. Now down here we have another illustration of that supply is this, and that's because that's our marginal cost curve. But let's just say producers are able to find a brand new efficiency that lets them produce the same quantity way out here, but at a lower cost. What will happen is you'll have the supply curve actually rotate down. And so this is going to be an increase in supply, but that increase is not from the number of producers because of the slope. So the slope of these two lines is not the same. So this is an increase in supply from an increase in efficiency of the cost. So I'm able to produce more. What if legislation comes in and causes our fixed costs to go up? It causes, maybe there's even a tax on different incentives of production like fertilizer. So you could end up with not a decrease in cost, but an increase in cost as well. And so that's going to cause a decrease in supply because that's going to be a higher cost situation. And so we end up being able to produce at this beginning spot. But what does the slope of the supply curve look like? And that slope is going to have a connection to a marginal cost change, which is from a cost of production change. So the slope of the supply curve talks about changes in the rate of supply. And so that is the concept of slope. So at the end of the day, where does supply come from? Well, we talked about it. Supply comes from producers, and they make their decisions on price.